It takes 9 months of careful biology to create a human life. But as today's 10 champions prove, it only takes a fraction of a second of pure stupidity to completely undo it all. We are diving into the absolute elite tier of Darwin Award winners, men who treated their mortal existence like a cheap rental car. Consider this your legally binding warning. Absolutely do not attempt to replicate a single catastrophic decision you see here today. 1. Let's paint a picture of rural India, where the local macaque population treats a farmer's meticulously cultivated vegetable patch like a complimentary 24-hour salad bar. Our protagonist wasn't the kind of guy to just build a taller fence or install some cheap motion sensor lights. He was a visionary who decided to solve a standard pest control problem with advanced psychological warfare. He deduced that monkeys are naturally terrified of apex predators, which is scientifically sound, but his execution was where he spectacularly derailed from the tracks of common sense. He went out and acquired a terrifyingly realistic, full-body bear costume. Visual intimidation simply wasn't enough for our homegrown tactical genius, though. He demanded total sensory domination. Knowing that the animal kingdom operates primarily on scent, he bought a bottle of commercial predator musk, essentially concentrated danger juice, and generously soaked his synthetic fur coat in it until he smelled like an angry grizzly that hadn't showered since the Pleistocene epoch. Fast forward to a pitch-black, humid night. Our farmer zips himself into this furry sauna of terrible decisions and waddles out into his fields. And here is the truly tragic part of the story. His master plan actually worked flawlessly. The macaques caught one whiff of this towering, reeking behemoth, stomping through the cabbage rows, and immediately evacuated the premises, leaving the farmer feeling like the undisputed supreme commander of the agricultural food chain. However, in his arrogant pursuit of ultimate monkey deterrence, he completely forgot to factor in the most lethal variable on his own payroll: his fiercely loyal, highly territorial, and heavily muscled guard dog. Let's do a quick refresher on basic canine biology here. Dogs do not care about your elaborate theatrical performance because their eyes take a permanent backseat to their noses. When the farmer's dog woke up from a nap, it didn't see its beloved owner playing dress-up in the moonlight. It smelled a massive, unfamiliar, heavily musked apex predator trespassing right in the middle of its sacred jurisdiction. What unfolded next wasn't a wacky misunderstanding. It was the flawless, unwavering execution of a guard dog's core operating system. The dog launched itself like a furry, teeth-guided missile directly at the source of the threat. Trapped inside a heavy, restrictive, heavily padded costume with virtually zero peripheral vision, the farmer couldn't even clearly yell his own dog's name through the thick, molded plastic snout of the mask before the tackle happened. The Canine Employee of the Month neutralized the perceived intruder with brutal, uncompromising efficiency, driven purely by the primal instinct to protect the homestead. When the sun rose the next morning, the monkeys were still hiding, the tomatoes were perfectly safe, and the farm's security system was sitting proudly next to its defeated enemy. The farmer successfully crafted a disguise so breathtakingly convincing that he tricked his own best friend into permanently revoking his existence, leaving the fiercely loyal dog sitting proudly over the defeated monster, patiently waiting for its owner to come outside and hand over a well-deserved bacon treat. 2. We all know that one guy who watches a 3-minute tutorial video and suddenly believes he holds a phantom doctorate in structural engineering. Our next backyard daredevil was staring out of his third-story apartment window at the beautiful, unforgiving cobblestone courtyard below, and an aggressively stupid idea began to incubate in his remarkably smooth brain. He decided the stairs were simply too mainstream, and what his life really needed was a custom-built zipline. Professional zipline constructors use heavy-duty galvanized steel cables, perfectly calibrated tensioning rigs, and complex braking systems to ensure humans don't turn into high-speed pavement abstract art. Our guy, however, decided to source his load-bearing infrastructure from a dusty plastic bin in his hallway closet. He proudly pulled out a standard, bright orange 50-foot electrical extension cord. He firmly believed that because the rubber casing felt somewhat thick, it inherently possessed the sheer tensile strength of a suspension bridge cable. He spent an hour meticulously tying one end of this conductive death trap to a heavy cast-iron radiator next to his window. tossed the remaining coil down to the courtyard, and ran down to tightly anchor the bottom end around the trunk of a massive oak tree. He had successfully created a taut, diagonal path of descent, blissfully oblivious to the unforgiving concept of dynamic load. Static weight is one thing, but when a human body drops and catches on a line, gravity dramatically accelerates that mass, multiplying the kinetic force exponentially. The tiny strands of copper wiring inside an extension cord are specifically manufactured to carry electrons to a leaf blower, not to withstand the violent, sudden shock of an adult male trying to shortcut his morning commute. With the confidence of a man who doesn't understand basic math, he grabbed a heavy-duty metal coat hanger to use as a makeshift sliding handle, because adding terrible metal-on-rubber friction to the equation was exactly what this disaster needed. He stepped up onto the windowsill, offered a cool nod to absolutely nobody, and confidently launched himself into the abyss. For exactly half a second, it was glorious. He was flying, defying gravity, living the action hero dream. And then, the slack ran out and the line pulled taut. The extension cord didn't just gracefully fail, it surrendered instantly and violently to the unyielding laws of physics. The internal copper wires snapped with a pathetic popping sound, and the rubber casing shredded under the immense, sudden pressure. He didn't even get to slide a single inch. The immediate, catastrophic structural failure transformed his cinematic zipline escape into an unabated, terrifying freefall. He was violently introduced to the cobblestone walkway face first, officially concluding his brief but spectacular career in amateur urban transportation. The irony of his final destination was much thicker than the head that got him there. The coroner's report probably had to note that while his DIY transit system was a fatal disaster, the extension cord he used was technically still rated to safely handle 15 amps of electrical current, meaning he successfully proved that a 15-amp electrical rating does absolutely nothing for structural integrity. 3. Have you ever felt so overwhelmed by the relentless noise of modern life that you wanted to crawl into a dark hole and disappear? Our next protagonist, a devoted disciple of DIY wellness culture and budget life hacking, decided to take that desire to its most terminal conclusion. He was obsessed with sensory deprivation tanks, those expensive spa pods filled with salt water where you float in pitch-black darkness to achieve perfect meditation. But our aspiring guru looked at the $80 hourly rental fee and scoffed, convinced he could build a vastly cheaper path to spiritual enlightenment right in his cluttered suburban garage. His brilliant solution was an industrial-sized chest freezer he bought off an online marketplace. He spent a weekend cleaning it, waterproofing the seams, and filling the bottom with a carefully calibrated, hyper-buoyant mixture of warm water and hundreds of pounds of Epsom salt. He even remembered to unplug the machine, completely avoiding the obvious electrocution hazard, which honestly makes the actual cause of his demise feel even more infuriatingly stupid. He accounted for the water, the buoyancy, and the electricity, but he managed to spectacularly fail to factor in the most fundamental biological requirement of human existence: continuous access to breathable oxygen. You see, the entire engineering purpose of a commercial chest freezer is to be 100% hermetically sealed. The thick rubber magnetic gasket lining the heavy lid is specifically designed to trap air inside and keep outside air out. It is essentially an airtight, impenetrable plastic vault. On a quiet Tuesday evening, seeking ultimate relaxation, our amateur guru climbed naked into his makeshift saltwater tub, lay back, and confidently pulled the heavy lid down tight, letting the magnetic gasket seal snugly around the rim and plunging himself into glorious, pitch-black nothingness. It was exactly what he wanted. He began to practice his deep breathing exercises, inhaling massive, calming lungfuls of air, blissfully unaware that he was setting a biological ticking timer on his own life. With every single exhalation, he was rapidly converting the tiny, severely limited volume of oxygen trapped inside that plastic box into heavier, toxic carbon dioxide. Because CO2 poisoning is notoriously sneaky, it creeps up without any dramatic warning signs, silently ambushing the brain before it even realizes something is horribly wrong. As he floated there in the utter darkness, believing he was reaching a state of profound Zen meditation, His consciousness was actually just slowly shutting down due to severe hypoxia. He drifted smoothly from a state of forced relaxation directly into a permanent, unbreakable sleep, eventually flatlining every vital function in his body one by one. He successfully achieved the absolute pinnacle of sensory deprivation, creating a peace so incredibly deep that he literally never woke up from it. When his confused roommates finally tracked him down a few days later, they didn't find an enlightened spiritual master. They found a perfectly preserved, extremely salty guy who had accidentally engineered his own airtight sarcophagus, delivering the ultimate lesson that while peace and quiet are lovely, ventilation is strictly non-negotiable. 4. Let's talk about the intoxicating allure of power tools and the absolute hubris they instill in suburban weekend warriors who consider reading a safety manual to be a sign of profound moral weakness. Our next casualty of boundless overconfidence was staring down a rusted, heavy-duty steel padlock that had stubbornly fused to his garden shed, a challenge to his masculinity that simply could not go unanswered. Instead of calling a locksmith or buying decent bolt cutters, he marched into his garage and emerged wielding an angle grinder. This is a terrifying piece of handheld machinery that spins a cutting abrasive at an absolutely blistering 11,000 revolutions per minute. To put that into perspective, that is roughly the same rotational speed as a commercial jet engine turbine, meaning it is definitely not a tool you want to casually modify based on a hunch you had while drinking a cheap light beer. But our guy, operating in perfect harmony with his own worst instincts, took one look at the factory-installed safety guard, a reinforced metal shield specifically engineered to prevent high-velocity shrapnel from giving the user an unrequested permanent haircut, and decided it was just a pesky visual obstruction ruining his line of sight. He grabbed a screwdriver, completely detached the life-saving barrier, and tossed it into his toolbox like an expired coupon. His descent into spectacular foolishness didn't stop at mere reckless endangerment, though. He decided to double down by blatantly ignoring the fundamental laws of metallurgy. Instead of mounting a reinforced, resin-bonded disc designed explicitly for slicing through hardened metal, he dug around his workbench and slapped on a dirt-cheap, highly brittle masonry wheel meant for scoring concrete blocks. His wildly flawed internal logic dictated that because stone is hard, a stone-cutting disc would simply chew through a steel lock even faster. He utterly failed to grasp that applying an abrasive meant for porous rock against dense, tempered steel, at 11,000 RPMs, generates an apocalyptic amount of destructive friction. With his safety guard discarded and his wildly incorrect disc locked in, he confidently squeezed the trigger, leaned his unhelmeted head entirely too close to the mechanical tornado he had just created, and pressed the spinning masonry wheel directly into the unforgiving steel shackle. The tragic physics equation balanced itself instantly. The brittle masonry disc couldn't bite into the metal. Instead, it rapidly superheated, caught a microscopic edge of the lock, and immediately experienced violent, explosive disintegration. The disc shattered into a dozen jagged, high-velocity ceramic projectiles flying outward in a perfect radius. Because he had so thoughtfully removed the only barrier designed to catch an exploding blade, a massive, high-velocity fragment bypassed his non-existent safety glasses entirely and acted as an instant, permanent off-switch for his consciousness. His earthly lease was abruptly cancelled, leaving behind a grimly ironic crime scene where the paramedics had to cut open the newly unlocked shed just to retrieve his body, confirming beyond all reasonable doubt that the only thing denser than tempered steel was his own skull. 5. There is a very specific, highly lethal brand of boredom that only strikes suburban men on a lazy Sunday afternoon, usually culminating in a desperate attempt to recreate medieval siege warfare using scrapyard junk. Our next architect of his own demise looked at a massive 15-foot concrete retaining wall in his backyard and decided it wasn't just a landscaping feature, it was the perfect launching pad for a homegrown aeronautics program. His masterpiece of reckless engineering was a mega seesaw, constructed by haphazardly balancing a massive, heavy-duty industrial steel I-beam over a stacked pile of cinder blocks at the base of the wall. Now, a normal playground seesaw relies on two roughly equal human weights, gently shifting the center of gravity to create a mild undulating motion. Our brilliant aerospace pioneer, however, opted to sit his incredibly fragile, meat-based body directly on the very bottom edge of this rigid steel ramp, essentially transforming himself into the living payload of a makeshift, high-yield trebuchet. The propulsion system for this backyard space agency was where the physics officially transitioned from a bad idea into a premeditated fatality. Standing proudly at the very top of the precipice was his loyal accomplice, hovering over the cracked, rusted remains of a 400-pound cast-iron engine block. The master plan, formulated without a single back-of-the-napkin calculation regarding kinetic energy or terminal velocity, was simply to drop a quarter-ton of dense metal onto the elevated side of the beam and ride the resulting shockwave to absolute glory. Using a long steel crowbar as a lever, the buddy at the top gave the massive block of iron a hefty shove, sending it plummeting over the concrete ledge. As the engine block entered freefall, our hero at the bottom probably experienced a fleeting microsecond of pure adrenaline, completely ignorant of the devastating mathematical formula he had just initiated. When 400 pounds of solid iron dropped from 15 feet squarely impacts a rigid steel lever, the kinetic energy doesn't just politely dissipate into the ground. It instantly and ruthlessly transfers directly to the opposite end of the fulcrum. The colossal impact flipped the steel beam with the savage, unyielding speed of a giant mousetrap snapping shut. Our homegrown astronaut wasn't merely lifted into the air. He was unceremoniously ejected from the earthly plane. He was launched upward and forward in a breathtaking, mathematically flawless parabolic arc. He sailed majestically over his own patio furniture, briefly experiencing the brief, glorious miracle of unassisted human flight, before making a sudden, bone-shattering, and deeply fatal introduction with the solid brick facade of his own two-story house. He was deleted from the gene pool upon impact, leaving behind a baffled friend, a slightly dented steel beam, and a wildly impressive human-shaped dent that served as a permanent architectural reminder that gravity remains undefeated, and Newton's third law of motion is absolutely not a mere suggestion you can ignore for a quick thrill. 6. The entertainment industry is packed with street performers who falsely believe they have developed a mystical, deeply spiritual connection with the absolutely merciless forces of nature. But our next misguided showman took his delusions of grandeur to a spectacularly fatal extreme. Picture a dusty, bustling tourist market where our protagonist, a remarkably overconfident snake charmer, was attempting to extract a few extra dollars from a crowd of wide-eyed onlookers by aggressively flirting with one of the most lethally efficient reptiles on the planet, a fully grown, wild-caught Indian cobra. For years, this guy had relied on a fundamental biological misconception to make his living. He genuinely believed that the melodic, reedy notes bleeding from his traditional wooden flute were somehow magically soothing the savage beast, lulling the venomous predator into a state of docile, musical appreciation. The harsh, scientific reality, however, is that cobras are essentially stone-deaf to ambient airborne sounds. They could not care less about your improvisational jazz solos. They rear up and sway, not because they are vibing to the rhythm, but because they are hyper-focusing on the physical movement of the instrument, tracking it cautiously as a potential, looming threat. But our performer was completely high on his own supply of mystic hype. Feeling the chaotic energy of the crowd and desperate for a spectacular, tip-generating finale, he made the catastrophic executive decision to bridge the gap between human and apex predator by planting a tender, affectionate kiss directly onto the hood of the deeply agitated snake. Take a moment to fully appreciate the absolute unhinged madness of this maneuver from the cobra's perspective. Reptiles operate on millions of years of ruthless evolutionary programming. They do not experience love, they do not understand showmanship, and they certainly do not appreciate uninvited physical intimacy from giant mammals. What the cobra perceived wasn't a loving gesture from a lifelong friend, but rather a massive, incredibly warm, heavily breathing biological heat signature suddenly lunging aggressively right into its primary strike zone. As the charmer puckered up and closed his eyes, presenting his exposed face like a giant, fleshy target at point-blank range, the snake did exactly what millions of years of survival instinct dictated it must do. It didn't hesitate or issue a polite warning hiss. It struck forward with the blinding, concussive speed of a spring-loaded rat trap, delivering a perfectly aimed, venom-loaded kiss right to the man's cheek. The romance was swiftly terminated as a massive dose of highly potent neurotoxic venom was express delivered straight into his system. The crowd's cheers curdled into panicked screams as the entertainer collapsed onto his dusty rug, learning the absolute hardest way possible that a cobra's venom is specifically designed to rapidly short-circuit the mammalian nervous system. Within mere minutes, the incredibly aggressive neurotoxin systematically strangled his nervous system from the inside out, neatly and decisively killing off his ability to breathe right there in the middle of the marketplace. He took his absolute final breath under the scorching afternoon sun, providing the traumatized tourists with an unforgettable, horrific demonstration that Mother Nature is completely immune to your charm. And she will brutally enforce her boundaries if you try to make out with her most toxic creations. 7. Autumn in the suburbs is a beautiful season completely ruined by the eternal warfare waged against falling leaves by middle-aged men wielding two-stroke engines. Our next victim of aggressive landscaping was a homeowner who looked at the wet, slippery sludge clogging his second-story gutters and decided that scooping it out by hand was a peasant's chore. He firmly believed that if a problem couldn't be solved by applying massive amounts of gasoline-powered horsepower, it simply wasn't worth solving. So, immediately following a soaking rainstorm, this absolute titan of terrible decision-making dragged a smooth aluminum extension ladder out of his garage. He propped it up against the siding of his house, resting the little rubber feet directly onto the soaking wet, friction-free concrete of his driveway. Now, a rational human being might test the stability of this setup, or perhaps ask someone to hold the base. But our guy had a mission, and he was already strapping a commercial-grade gas leaf blower onto his back. Here's the science lesson that this guy clearly slept through. A high-powered leaf blower doesn't just gently puff air. It rapidly forces compressed atmosphere through a narrow nozzle, basically acting like a miniature jet engine. And according to Sir Isaac Newton, blasting a 200-mile-per-hour hurricane out of a plastic tube generates a significant amount of backward thrust. Cheerfully ignoring the fundamental laws of aerodynamics, our hero confidently scaled the slippery rungs, turning himself into a highly unbalanced, top-heavy pendulum of doom. He reached the absolute highest, least stable step of the ladder, leaned way out over the edge, and pointed the nozzle straight down the gutter channel. Without a single moment of self-preservation, he fully engaged the throttle, cranking the engine to its absolute maximum RPMs. The blower roared to life, blasting the wet leaves out of the gutter, but simultaneously shoving the man's upper body forcefully backward with the sheer force of a small thruster. That sudden lateral kickback was the exact variable the wet concrete had been waiting for. The minimal friction holding the ladder's rubber feet in place was instantly overpowered. In a fraction of a second, the bottom of the ladder violently kicked out from underneath him like a cartoon banana peel slipping on a freshly mopped floor. His glorious command over nature was immediately revoked as gravity aggressively took the wheel, sending him plummeting headfirst toward the unforgiving pavement from 20 feet in the air. The resulting impact with the driveway spectacularly and irreversibly ended his subscription to life, simultaneously removing him from the neighborhood association. The paramedics arrived to find him decisively checked out of existence, tangled in his twisted aluminum death trap, with the leaf blower still faithfully idling on his back. A noisy, tragic monument to a man who successfully cleared his gutters by accidentally engineering his own rocket-assisted demise. 8. Summer heat waves possess a unique ability to melt away all basic human common sense, inspiring people to construct backyard cooling solutions that blatantly violate every known electrical safety code. Our next doomed inventor was suffering through a brutally humid August afternoon, staring at his blistering concrete patio, and decided he was going to brilliantly life-hack his way to thermal comfort. He wanted the luxurious experience of an expensive theme park misting fan, but he absolutely refused to spend actual money to achieve it. Instead, he scoured his heavily cluttered garage and proudly emerged with a massive, heavy-duty industrial metal shop fan, the kind that sounds like a prop plane taking off and is housed entirely inside a highly conductive steel cage. To transform this wind machine into a makeshift oasis, he grabbed his garden hose, screwed on a cheap plastic misting nozzle, and crudely zip-tied the high-pressure water source directly to the metal grill of the fan. Now, water and high-voltage electricity are famously mortal enemies, a fundamental truth taught to actual toddlers, but our guy felt incredibly confident in his crude engineering. He dragged his contraption onto the patio and plugged it directly into an ungrounded outdoor wall outlet. But the absolute pièce de resistance of his fatal master plan was the fan's power cord itself, which had been dragged across abrasive concrete so many times that the thick black rubber insulation was completely shredded, exposing the raw, gleaming copper wiring underneath. He flicked the switch, the massive blade spun up, and a glorious, cooling mist began to spray across his backyard. For about 10 minutes, he was an absolute genius. However, he completely failed to account for the basic concept of water accumulation. The mist wasn't just cooling the air, it was rapidly pooling heavily on the uneven concrete directly beneath the fan, creating a massive puddle that aggressively swallowed the frayed, dangerously exposed power cord resting on the ground. To make matters infinitely worse, our backyard Thomas Edison was walking around completely barefoot, essentially transforming his moist, sweaty body into a perfect, fleshy lightning rod. As the 120 volts of alternating current eagerly abandoned the exposed copper and instantly electrified the entire pool of water, the surrounding concrete became a localized death zone. Noticing that his misting nozzle had vibrated slightly out of alignment, our barefooted hero confidently splashed right into the electrified puddle and reached out with both wet hands to grab the solid metal casing of the running fan. The moment his fingers touched the steel, he completed a textbook, zero-resistance electrical circuit. A massive, lethal surge of household electricity bypassed the fan's motor completely, turning his entire body into a pristine, high-voltage conductor before grounding out through his bare feet into the soaked concrete. He was hit with the ultimate shocking reality check, his muscles locking up in a violent spasm that kept his hands welded to his own deadly contraption until his body gave its absolute final performance. A grim and sizzling testament to the fact that extreme frugality is a cocktail mixed by the Reaper. 9. You know the type. The fiercely stubborn guy who treats asking a friend for help with heavy lifting as a humiliating admission of biological inferiority, as if calling a buddy to move an appliance is somehow a signed confession of physical weakness. This particular casualty of pure, unfiltered macho pride was staring down a steep, narrow, wooden basement staircase, tasked with moving a massive 300-pound French door smart refrigerator. A normal, functioning adult would immediately call a buddy, offer them free pizza and beer, and carefully navigate the appliance down the steps as a synchronized team. But our guy, fueled by an unwarranted belief in his own Herculean strength, decided he was going to solo carry this gigantic metal monolith into his subterranean man cave, using nothing but a flimsy two-wheeled aluminum hand truck and an absolute mountain of misplaced confidence. He strapped the towering behemoth to the dolly, wheeled it to the edge of the precipice, and made the staggeringly terrible tactical decision to guide the massive appliance down the stairs backwards. He stood on the steps below the fridge, gripping the handles from underneath, placing his squishy, fragile body squarely in the direct path of impending gravitational doom. Let's quickly review the merciless physics of inclined planes and shifting centers of mass. When a 300-pound rectangular box is standing perfectly upright on a flat surface, its weight is evenly distributed directly over its wheels, making it relatively easy to roll. However, the exact second you tilt that towering appliance backward onto a 45-degree downward slope, the center of gravity drastically shifts forward, radically transferring the vast majority of that crushing, dead weight directly onto whatever poor soul is holding the handles at the bottom. Our stubborn strongman managed to bump the fridge down the first 2 stairs, sweating profusely and feeling like an absolute champion of solo logistics. But as he descended deeper into the narrow stairwell, the angle of the stairs became slightly steeper. The fridge tilted just a few degrees further, crossing the invisible, fatal threshold of no return. In a terrifying fraction of a second, the entire 300-pound load shifted dynamically, completely overwhelming his grip strength and turning his biceps to absolute jelly. He couldn't push it back up, and he certainly couldn't hold it steady. Gravity, completely unbothered by his massive ego, aggressively took over the entire operation. The heavy rubber tires slipped off the edge of the wooden tread, and the colossal smart fridge transformed into an unstoppable, high-speed steel avalanche. It instantly overpowered his fragile grip, treating the homeowner like a minor speed bump on its unstoppable, high-speed express route to the basement. The chaotic descent ended with a massive, booming crash at the very bottom landing, where the heavy appliance completely pinned him against the unforgiving concrete foundation wall. The sheer, concentrated force of the impact permanently and abruptly ended his DIY career on the spot, closing out his story under a mountain of brushed steel and proving that a delivery fee is genuinely the best life insurance you can buy. 10. The world of off-road vehicle recovery is governed by strict safety protocols and an acute respect for stored kinetic energy, none of which mattered to our final victim. A man who firmly believed that a big pickup truck could magically solve any problem if you just floored the gas pedal hard enough. He was out on his rural property, locked in a bitter, sweaty feud with an ancient, deeply embedded wooden fence post that was heavily anchored in a massive ball of solid concrete and thick, stubborn tree roots. After hitting it with a sledgehammer and relentlessly digging around it, yielded absolutely zero results. He decided it was time to deploy the nuclear option. He backed up his heavily lifted pickup truck, unspooled the heavy-duty winch from his front bumper, and prepared to rip the post directly out of the earth. But instead of using a static, non-stretching heavy metal chain designed specifically for pulling dead weight, he dug into the bed of his truck and grabbed a bright yellow, woven nylon kinetic recovery strap. Now, kinetic straps are absolute lifesavers if you are trying to yank a stuck Jeep out of deep mud, specifically because the nylon material is engineered to stretch up to 30% under heavy load. It aggressively builds up immense rubber band-like tension to smoothly yank vehicles free. But using a highly elastic strap to pull a completely stationary, deeply rooted object from the ground is essentially constructing a giant, lethal, high-velocity slingshot. Completely ignorant to the terrifying physics engine he was booting up, he wrapped one end around the stubborn post, hooked the other to his winch, and hit the remote control. The steel cable tightened, pulling the nylon strap incredibly taut. The truck groaned, the engine whined, but the post stubbornly refused to budge. The nylon strap was now stretched to its absolute maximum capacity, quietly storing a catastrophic, terrifying amount of violent potential energy. Frustrated by the lack of progress, our automotive genius made his final fatal mistake. He dropped the winch remote, stepped out of his truck, and walked directly up to the post to visually inspect the roots, planting himself dead center in what professional tow operators grimly refer to as the snapback zone. He was standing squarely in the direct, geometric line of fire of a fully loaded high-tension weapon. As he leaned over to poke at the dirt with his boot, the massive subterranean taproot finally surrendered with a loud, thunderous snap. The sudden release of resistance allowed the hyper-stretched nylon strap to viciously whip back to its original length. All of that stored potential energy was instantaneously converted into brutal kinetic energy in a single, horrifying microsecond. The heavy wooden post, still attached to a massive, jagged 50-pound chunk of solid concrete, was violently ripped from the earth and launched backward through the air like a medieval ballista bolt. Traveling at roughly the speed of a highway car crash, the muddy, concrete-tipped missile connected dead center with his face. The devastating impact instantly and permanently clocked him out of the land of the living, terminating his earthly existence on the spot, and serving as a brutal reminder that when you play tug-of-war with a giant rubber band, your face shouldn't be the finish line. 1. We open on the breathtaking coast of California, a place where property values are so high, you're not just buying land, you're buying a zip code with its own gravitational pull. Here lived a man we'll call Gregory, a software tycoon whose bank account was matched only by his ego. He had just acquired the ultimate trophy, a cliffside mansion so modern and majestic, it looked like it was designed by Apple. But there was a flaw in his paradise, a smudge on his masterpiece. A colossal, prehistoric granite boulder, which had been stoically minding its own business for millennia, had the audacity to exist in a spot that partially interrupted the panoramic view from his master bedroom. We're not talking a total eclipse here. It was more like nature had left a single enormous thumbprint on the corner of his living work of art. For a normal person, this would be a feature. For Gregory, a man who believed the universe owed him a perfectly curated experience, this was a personal insult. he embarked on a scorched earth legal campaign against the California Coastal Commission, arguing that the rock was infringing on his constitutional right to an unobstructed sunset. After the courts, in a shocking turn of events, sided with the 10,000-year-old rock, Gregory decided that if the law wouldn't bend to his will, then geology certainly would. He went online and found what can only be described as the gig economy for highly questionable activities. He hired a demolition crew whose primary qualifications seemed to be owning a rusty pickup truck and a profound disrespect for building codes. They arrived with a quantity of black market explosives that could have resolved a small border dispute, ready to take on Gregory's geological nemesis. Now, a quick, condescending lesson in how cliffs work. They are not solid blocks of stone. They are a complex, fragile system held together by a delicate balance of compression, tension, and sheer dumb luck. Basically, nature's poorly stacked pile of dishes. Introducing a massive, uncontrolled explosion to this equation is like trying to fix a Swiss watch with a sledgehammer. On the big day, Gregory stood on his titanium and glass balcony, cocktail in hand, radiating the smug satisfaction of a man about to fire God and personally redesign a portion of his creation. The blast that followed was not the neat, surgical pop he'd paid for. It was a biblical, earth-shattering concussion that rattled windows 30 miles away. And to be fair, it worked. The boulder was gone, instantly vaporized. The problem was the explosion also fired the entire support structure of the cliff face. It rang the cliff like a giant bell, and the cliff answered by collectively resigning from its job of holding up Gregory's house. For one fleeting, beautiful second, Gregory had it all. His perfect, 180-degree, boulder-free view of the Pacific Ocean. This was immediately followed by the deeply unsettling sensation of his multi-million-dollar mansion performing a slow, graceful nosedive into the abyss. The landslide wasn't just a landslide, it was a full-scale topographical rearrangement, and his house, with him in it, was the main event. In his final moments, Gregory became a temporary resident of the very view he so desperately coveted, as his home completed its journey from cliffside mansion to future coral reef. 2. Picture the skyline of Dubai, a city built on the philosophy that if you can dream it, you can build it twice as tall and cover it in gold. Our subject is Ferris, a seasoned window washer who treated the laws of gravity with the casual contempt of a man who'd spent years defying them. His office was the 80th floor of a gleaming super skyscraper, a place where the air is thin and the margin for error is even thinner. Ferris was a master of his craft, an artist with a squeegee, but years of dangling thousands of feet in the air had eroded his survival instinct, replacing it with a lethal strain of impatience. His safety equipment, the harness, the double redundant lines, the clips that could support a small car, had ceased to be his lifeline and had become his nemesis. In his mind, they were bureaucratic shackles, an inefficient system designed to slow down his workflow. He had declared a one-man war on an extra 30 seconds of labor. Now, let's talk about wind at 1,000 feet. It's not the gentle breeze you feel on the street. Up there, the wind is a physical entity, a bored predator that prowls the glass canyons of the city. It whips around corners with the force of a freight train and can create updrafts that want to turn you into a human kite. The safety line isn't just for when you slip. It's an anchor to reality itself, a tether that stops the sky from simply deciding it wants to keep you. On this particular afternoon, Ferris was confronted with a small, stubborn smudge on the glass, located in a spot that was just inconveniently out of reach. To follow protocol, he would have to spend a full 2 minutes methodically repositioning his entire rig. Or, he could unhook his main line for what his brain assured him would be, just a second. This phrase, the unofficial motto of the Darwin Awards, echoed in his head. He glanced around. His only audience was the sun and a distant helicopter. Convinced of his own invincibility, he reached down and with a confident click, he detached the one thing connecting him to the world of the living. He was free, unburdened. He leaned out with the grace of a trapeze artist, his squeegee extended, and vanquished the smudge in a single, masterful stroke. In that moment of pure professional triumph, he was the greatest window washer in the world. And that's when the wind, which had been waiting patiently for just such an act of spectacular hubris, decided to introduce itself. An invisible wall of air slammed into the building, catching Ferris and turning his small platform into a bucking bronco. For a tethered man, it would have been a terrifying lurch. For Ferris, it was a one-way, non-stop ticket to the ground floor. His quest for peak efficiency had reached its ultimate conclusion. He had successfully shaved 2 minutes off his workday, and the rest of his life off his schedule. His final view was of a perfectly clean pane of glass, as he accelerated past it at 120 miles per hour, a silent testament to a job well done. 3. We travel now to a small village in South Africa, where we meet Themba, a man whose boundless faith was about to have a very loud, very brief argument with physics. Themba had become the star client of a local shaman who was marketing a revolutionary new product, a bulletproof potion. This wasn't a metaphor for spiritual protection. The label on the bottle might as well have read, "Guaranteed to stop anything short of a speeding train." The elixir was a gritty, brown liquid that looked like it was sourced from a puddle. But Themba consumed it with the reverence of a wine connoisseur. He wasn't just a believer. He was a walking, talking, and soon-to-be bleeding advertisement. He would strut through the village, chest puffed out, proclaiming himself untouchable, a modern-day Achilles whose entire body was the heel. His confidence was infectious, and he soon convinced his friends that they were on the verge of witnessing a miracle. He decided the time had come for a public demonstration, a product launch party with a live fire exercise. Let's hit pause for a quick science PSA that was tragically unavailable in Themba's village. A bullet fired from a rifle is a small, copper-jacketed messenger of bad news, traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. It carries an immense amount of kinetic energy, and its entire existence is dedicated to the singular purpose of not being stopped by things like air, flesh, or wishful thinking. A potion, on the other hand, is essentially a beverage. Its primary function is hydration. Pitting one against the other is like trying to stop a charging rhino with a strongly worded letter. Undeterred by the complete lack of scientific precedent, Themba gathered a crowd. With the flair of a Vegas magician, he chugged the entire bottle of the shaman's special brew, wiped his mouth, and spread his arms wide. He then handed a high-powered hunting rifle to his most trusted friend. The friend hesitated, a flicker of rational thought trying to break through the mob mentality. But Themba was adamant. He pointed to the center of his chest. "Shoot me," he commanded, his voice booming with the certainty of a man who genuinely believed he had unlocked God mode. They must see the power. In his mind's eye, he could already see the scene, the bullet flattening against his skin like a cartoon, the awestruck gasps of the villagers, his name being passed down in legends for generations. The rifle blast shattered the afternoon quiet. The bullet, entirely unaware of the magical properties it was supposed to be impressed by, performed its job with brutal efficiency. It did not slow down. It did not deflect. It simply continued on its path, a path that led directly through Themba's chest, which it turned out was still very much bullet permeable. The demonstration was a resounding success in proving one thing: the shaman's potion was, at best, a mild diuretic. Themba's quest for immortality was over in a fraction of a second, a tragic but definitive victory for the unyielding laws of physics over a really bad marketing campaign. The shaman, when later confronted, reportedly suggested that Themba must have had a moment of doubt, which voided the warranty. 4. Let's take a trip to the heart of Italy, the land of fine art, passionate romance, and in this case, industrial-grade cheese. Our protagonist is Enzo, a criminal mastermind whose plans tended to have the structural integrity of a wet spaghetti noodle. Enzo wasn't a cat burglar or a high-tech thief. He was more of a low-level opportunist whose career was a series of poorly executed smash-and-grabs. One fateful night, he set his sights on what he believed was the ultimate score: a Parmesan cheese factory. His plan, presumably sketched out on a greasy napkin, was simple. Get in, grab as many wheels of the king of cheeses as he could carry, and get out. The get-in part went surprisingly well. It was the get-out part that hit a snag in the form of a silent alarm, which was now screaming its electronic head off and broadcasting his location to every police car in the province. Panic, Enzo's most trusted co-pilot in all his endeavors took the wheel. He dropped the heavy cheese wheels and scrambled for a hiding place. He needed something brilliant, something unpredictable, a place no one would ever think to look. And then he saw it, gleaming under the factory's emergency lights. A colossal stainless steel vat, the size of a small swimming pool, filled to the brim with a golden mountain of pre-grated parmesan. To a rational mind, this was just part of the production line. To Enzo's panic-addled brain, it was a stroke of genius. It was a cheesy, dairy-based invisibility cloak. Perfecto! He likely whispered to himself. I'll be a ghost, a delicious ghost. Let's take a brief, condescending moment to discuss the physics of granular materials. Grated Parmesan cheese, when stored in bulk, is not the light, fluffy stuff you sprinkle on your pasta. It's a dense, heavy, and surprisingly compact medium. It behaves less like a pile of feathers and more like a pile of sand. Immersing yourself in it is a concept known in farming as grain entrapment, a horrifyingly effective way to die. The material settles around you, locking your limbs in place while its immense weight compresses your chest, making it impossible to breathe. It is, quite literally, death by 1,000 tiny salty cuts. Enzo, having missed this particular day in science class, saw only a brilliant escape. He clambered up the side of the vat and, with the triumphant leap of a man who believes he's just outsmarted all of law enforcement, he dove in. For a few seconds, it must have felt perfect. He burrowed down, pulling the cheese over his head like a blanket, the sharp, nutty aroma filling his nostrils. The distant sirens faded. He was safe. He was a genius. Then, the reality of his situation began to settle in. Literally. The cheese, disturbed by his entry, began to compact around him, gripping him like 1,000 tiny hands. He tried to shift his weight to create an air pocket, but he couldn't move. The pressure on his chest was immense. He tried to scream, but only managed to inhale a lungful of finely aged dairy. The very thing he was trying to steal had become his sarcophagus. The police arrived, did a thorough but ultimately fruitless search of the factory, and left, assuming the thief had escaped. Enzo was found the next morning by a factory worker who was about to start the bagging process and noticed an unusual lump in the vat. In the end, Enzo achieved a level of intimacy with Parmesan that no foodie could ever dream of. He became a permanent silent ingredient in a batch that was, thankfully, immediately decommissioned. A chilling testament to a man whose final, fatal thought was likely, "This was not as clever as it seemed 5 minutes ago." 5. Our next exhibit takes us to the vast, majestic, and utterly indifferent waters of the Pacific Ocean. Here we meet a woman we'll call Serenity, a person who had taken the concept of being one with nature to a level that bordered on a restraining order violation against the entire animal kingdom. Serenity was convinced she possessed a rare and profound gift, the ability to communicate with whales. Not in a scientific, observational way, but in a deep, spiritual, "I know what you're feeling, Mr. Humpback" kind of way. She believed that the complex clicks and groans of these cetaceans were not just for navigation and mating, but were cosmic poetry, and she was the only one with the emotional decoder ring to understand them. Her grand theory was that she could bridge the gap between species not with research, but with song. She decided that the best way to initiate this dialogue was to paddle her tiny, brightly colored kayak several miles offshore, far from the pesky regulations and tour boats, to find a whale and serenade it. Let's pause for a quick reality check from the world of marine biology. A humpback whale is a 40-ton, 50-foot-long mammal. It is not a golden retriever of the sea. It is a massive, wild animal that operates on instinct, and its primary thoughts revolve around eating krill and avoiding container ships. They are powerful enough to breach their entire bodies out of the water and create a splash that could capsize a small boat. This is precisely why there are federal laws mandating that you stay at least 100 yards away from them. Not for the whale's safety, but because getting too close to one is like playing patty cake with a living, breathing freight train. Serenity, viewing these laws as the work of soulless bureaucrats who just didn't get it, paddled out into the deep blue. After hours of searching, she spotted a plume of spray in the distance. This was it. Her moment. Closing her eyes and channeling what she believed was the primordial frequency of the ocean, she began to sing. The sound that emerged was a strange, ethereal warble, a mix of yodeling and chanting that had no equivalent in the known animal kingdom. To her, it was a beautiful invitation. To a 40-ton humpback peacefully going about its day, it was the most bizarre and irritating noise it had ever heard. The whale, its curiosity piqued by this acoustic anomaly, decided to investigate. Serenity saw the enormous, dark shape moving beneath the surface, and her heart swelled with joyous validation. "He's coming to me," she thought, completely misinterpreting the whale's internal monologue, which was likely closer to, "What in the world is making that awful racket?" She prepared herself for a profound spiritual connection. What she got was a lesson in displacement. The whale, not out of malice but sheer curiosity, surfaced directly beneath her ridiculously small kayak to get a better look. The effect was not gentle. Serenity and her vessel were launched into the air as if from a catapult, flipping end over end before crashing into the frigid 50-degree water. The shock of the cold was instantaneous, a full-body gasp that stole her breath. The whale, its curiosity sated and its ears no longer offended, simply gave a fluke of its tail and dove back into the silent depths, completely unaware that its brief investigation had just concluded a human life. Serenity got her wish to be one with nature. She became a permanent part of the marine ecosystem, a tragic footnote in the story of a woman who tried to start a conversation with a creature the size of a submarine and was, in the most literal sense, completely overturned by its response. 6. Welcome to the modern American battlefield, the parking lot of a suburban mall on a weekend. It's a place where social contracts are shredded and the thin veneer of civilization is stripped away in the hunt for a slightly less inconvenient place to leave your car. Our hero in this story is Gary, a man whose loyalty to his friends was about to be tested against the unyielding reality of a 2-ton SUV. Gary was on a mission. His friend, Kevin, was on his way, and Gary had spotted the perfect parking space opening up. A prime piece of real estate, mere steps from the department store entrance. But the parking lot was a shark tank, and other cars were circling. Gary, a self-styled parking paladin, knew he had to act fast. Standing in the spot and waving his arms felt too confrontational. He needed a strategy that was both bold and, in his mind, utterly foolproof. He decided that the best way to claim this territory was to physically occupy it in the most definitive way possible. He was going to lie down. Let's briefly analyze the logic here, or the spectacular lack thereof. A human being standing upright is a recognized shape to a driver. It says, "Person, do not hit." A human being lying horizontally on black asphalt, however, especially in the cluttered visual landscape of a parking lot, has the visibility of a discarded coat. A driver is scanning for other cars, rogue shopping carts, and upright pedestrians. They are not typically scanning the ground for camouflaged, napping idiots. The modern driver is also often distracted, glancing at a GPS, changing the music, or, as was the case here, firing off a quick text message. Gary's plan relied on the flawless situational awareness of a complete stranger, a famously reliable variable. Convinced of his own genius, Gary lay down in the center of the empty spot, arms folded peacefully on his chest, a smug look on his face. He was a human cone, a living spot-saved sign. He watched as a large SUV began to turn into his aisle. Perfect, he thought. They'll see me, have a good laugh at my cleverness, and move on. The driver of the SUV, a woman fully engrossed in a text conversation about brunch plans, saw only what she wanted to see: an empty space. Her brain, prioritizing the hunt for parking, filtered out any data that didn't fit the vacant spot profile. From her elevated driver's seat, the prone form of Gary simply didn't register. Gary held his ground, a silent martyr for parking convenience, confident that at any second the vehicle would stop. The vehicle did stop, but only after both of its right side tires had rolled directly over him. The driver felt a slight bump, which she attributed to a pothole or a curb, put the car in park, and turned off the engine, pleased with her find. Gary's grand, selfless gesture had come to a sudden and very flat conclusion. He had successfully saved the spot, But the friend he was saving it for would now need to find parking at the local funeral home. The tragic irony is that he died for a principle that every single driving instructor in the world could have debunked. A car is always bigger than you are, especially when you're lying down. 7. Picture this. 13,000 feet above the sun-baked Earth, the door of a small airplane opens to reveal a breathtaking panorama of blue sky and swirling clouds. This is the office of our next subject, a skydiver we'll call Jared. But he wasn't just a skydiver, he was an artist. His medium wasn't paint or clay, it was adrenaline-soaked, high-definition video. Jared was a cameraman, the guy responsible for capturing those incredible, vertigo-inducing shots of people happily leaping into the void. And he was damn good at it. His entire identity was wrapped up in getting the perfect shot. He viewed the world through a wide-angle lens, and his life's purpose was to document the raw, unfiltered joy of human flight. His fatal flaw wasn't recklessness or a death wish. It was a level of single-minded focus so intense that it had the unfortunate side effect of occasionally deleting basic survival protocols from his brain. On this perfect, cloudless day, he was filming a tandem jump for a group of first-timers. The energy in the plane was electric, a mixture of terror and excitement. Jared was in his element, not as a participant, but as a director. He was a whirlwind of activity, checking his helmet-mounted cameras, adjusting exposure settings, giving his subjects encouraging thumbs-ups, and framing the perfect pre-jump shots. He was so completely absorbed in the role of documentarian that he viewed the entire process from behind the camera, a detached observer capturing a scene. Let's take a moment for a very simple how to skydive tutorial. Step 1. Get in a plane. Step 2. Put on a parachute. Step 3. Jump out of the plane. Step 4. Pull the cord on the parachute you remembered in Step 2. This checklist is not complex. It's not open to artistic interpretation. The parachute, specifically, is a non-negotiable piece of equipment, the one thing that separates a thrilling extreme sport from a very brief, very messy science experiment in terminal velocity. As the plane reached altitude, Jared filmed his friends getting their final gear checks. He got beautiful close-ups of their nervous smiles, the instructor securing their harnesses, the whole 9 yards. He was capturing the moment perfectly. The door slid open, and a roar of wind filled the cabin. One by one, the jumpers, securely attached to their instructors and their life-saving gear, disappeared into the blue. Jared, ever the professional, leaned out to get a stunning shot of them falling away, shrinking into tiny specks against the vast landscape. Then it was his turn. The grand finale. He turned the camera on himself for the heroic first-person shot that would be the centerpiece of the video. He gave the lens a confident rock-and-roll salute, flashed a movie star grin, and with the practiced grace of a seasoned professional, he leapt out of the plane. For a few glorious seconds, it was perfect. He was flying, the camera was rolling, and the world was his stage. It was only when he reached for the ripcord to deploy his chute that he encountered a critical equipment malfunction, the utter and complete absence of the parachute itself. In his obsessive quest to film everyone else's safety preparations, he had completely forgotten his own. The high-definition camera, still recording, dutifully documented the transition on his face from godlike exhilaration to wide-eyed, dawning horror. He had managed to produce the ultimate once-in-a-lifetime footage, a breathtaking first-person documentary of his own preventable demise, a cinematic masterpiece with a tragically abrupt ending. 8. Our stage for this act is a dreary, rain-swept apartment in England, a location about as far removed from the Gothic spires of Transylvania as one could get. But for a man named Adrian, this was merely a temporary lair. Adrian wasn't just a fan of vampire lore, he was a full-time, unpaid method actor in a movie that existed only in his head. He had gone all in on the vampire lifestyle. He had custom-made, surgically implanted fangs. He slept during the day and only emerged at night, draped in black velvet. He likely spoke with a vaguely Eastern European accent that he'd honed by watching old horror films. His commitment was absolute. His fundamental, fatal error was believing that Bram Stoker's Dracula was not a work of fiction, but a highly detailed instruction manual. He took every piece of lore as gospel, and one particular piece of vampire dogma lodged itself in his brain. A vampire, he believed, draws its power from its native soil and must rest in it to survive. For Adrian, this wasn't a metaphor. It was a biological necessity. And since he was from Romania, he decided he needed a fresh supply of his homeland. So he embarked on the most bizarre logistical challenge imaginable, importing several hundred pounds of Romanian dirt into the United Kingdom. Imagine the customs declaration form for that one. Now, let's have a quick, sarcastic chat with a microbiologist. Soil is not just inert dirt. It is one of the most densely populated ecosystems on the planet, a thriving metropolis of bacteria, viruses, amoebas, and most importantly for our story, fungal spores. It's a microscopic war zone of organisms competing for survival. While most of this is harmless, some of these tiny residents can be incredibly dangerous if, say, an idiot decides to inhale them for 8 hours a night while sleeping in a poorly ventilated wooden box. Adrian, blissfully unaware of the microbial assassins he was paying a fortune to ship across a continent, finally received his sacred cargo. He filled a custom-built coffin to the brim with his sacred earth and began his nightly ritual. He would lower himself into the coffin, pulling the rich, dark soil over his body like a blanket, convinced he was recharging his supernatural energies. In reality, with every breath, he was inhaling a concentrated dose of a rare, aggressive fungus native to that specific region of Romania. The decline was ironically slow. He started to feel weak, fatigued. He probably interpreted this as a sign that his transformation was deepening, that his mortal body was struggling with the newfound power. He developed a persistent cough, which he likely romanticized as the consumption of a tragic Gothic hero. He was dying, not from a wooden stake or exposure to sunlight, but from a mundane, soil-borne pulmonary infection. Paramedics eventually broke down his door after neighbors reported a foul smell, only to be confronted with a scene straight out of a low-budget horror film. A pale man in a coffin full of dirt. The coroner's report was the final, brutal punchline. Adrian hadn't died a creature of the night. He had died of a fungal infection he had personally imported, a victim of a level of commitment to a fictional character that his own immune system simply could not support. 9. Let's visit a quiet suburban street on a sweltering Saturday afternoon, the natural habitat of the weekend DIY warrior. Meet Dave, a man whose confidence in his own handyman skills was legendary, and whose respect for safety warnings was purely theoretical. Dave's personal philosophy was that instruction manuals were written by cowards, and that any problem could be solved with enough brute force and misplaced optimism. His project for the day was a minor roof repair, a task he felt was well within his capabilities. He was using a pneumatic staple gun, a powerful tool designed to drive heavy-duty staples through shingles and wood with effortless ease. The job was going fine until the inevitable happened. The gun jammed. A normal person, or even a slightly cautious one, might recognize this as a moment to pause. They might climb down from the roof, disconnect the air compressor, and safely clear the jam according to the manufacturer's instructions. But Dave was not a normal person. To him, this jam wasn't a mechanical issue. It was a personal challenge, a duel between man and machine, and he wasn't about to be outsmarted by a tool he'd bought on sale. Let's have a quick patronizing look at how a pneumatic staple gun works. It's not a toy. It's a focused explosion of compressed air that fires a metal projectile. For this reason, it has a critical safety feature, a small plunger on the nose that must be fully depressed against a surface before the gun can fire. This feature is specifically designed to prevent the gun from firing into the empty air, or, for example, into the user's face. It is a foolproof system designed to protect fools from themselves. Dave, however, was about to prove that no system is truly foolproof to a sufficiently motivated fool. Frustrated, he shook the gun. He smacked it against the roof. The staple remained lodged. He decided he needed a closer look. He needed to peer directly into the barrel of the gun to diagnose the problem. To do this, he needed the gun to be steady. So, in a moment of sublime, galaxy-brained stupidity, he lifted the tool to his face and pressed the nose of the gun firmly against his own forehead to hold it still while he squinted into the nozzle. He had, in effect, used his own skull to defeat the one safety mechanism designed to save his life. The pressure from his forehead depressed the safety plunger, engaging the firing mechanism. The force of being pressed against his head also happened to be just enough to dislodge the jammed staple. The gun, now free and fully operational, did exactly what it was designed to do. With a sharp thud of compressed air, it fired the 2-inch metal staple directly through its new target surface, Dave's forehead, and deep into his frontal lobe. His wife found him a short while later, a tragic monument to the idea that the most dangerous component of any tool is the person holding it. He had not only ignored the safety rules, he had actively conspired with the safety feature to bring about his own demise. 10. Our final tale unfolds on the deep blue waters of the ocean, the setting for a primal struggle between man and fish. Our captain for this voyage is a fisherman we'll call Ron, a man whose ego was significantly larger than his boat. Ron wasn't in it for the peaceful communion with nature. He was in it for the glory, the bragging rights, and the hero shot back at the dock with him posing next to a giant, vanquished sea monster. His defining characteristic was a profound impatience, a belief that nature's timeline could be bent to his will through sheer, stubborn force. On this day, he hooked the fish of a lifetime, a massive swordfish, a powerhouse of muscle and fury with a spear attached to its face. Now, there is a very specific, time-honored procedure for landing a fish like this, and it can be summarized in 2 words. Tire it out. You don't fight a swordfish, you dance with it. You let it run, you let it jump, you use the drag of the reel and the maneuverability of the boat to let it exhaust its incredible energy reserves over a long, grueling battle. Only when the fish is spent and docile do you bring it carefully alongside the boat to be secured. Bringing a fresh, enraged, green swordfish on board is the maritime equivalent of wrestling a running chainsaw. Ron, however, viewed this patient strategy as a form of weakness. His friends were watching. The clock was ticking. He decided he was going to horse it in, a term for using brute strength to drag the fish to the boat before it's ready. He cranked the reel's drag system down to a dangerously high setting and began a bare-knuckle brawl with the fish, putting a terrifying amount of strain on the line, the rod, and his own body. The fish, for its part, was not enjoying this experience. It was thrashing, leaping, and getting progressively angrier. Against the advice of everyone else on the boat, Ron managed to winch the still livid creature to the side of the vessel. It was boiling the water, its powerful tail slapping against the hull. The safe play was to use a long-handled gaff to control its head from a distance. But Ron was high on adrenaline and victory. In a final act of impatient machismo, he decided to grab the thick leader line with his bare hands, leaning far over the side of the boat to haul his prize aboard personally. This was the moment the swordfish had been waiting for. It was cornered, it was furious, and it had one last desperate move. With a final explosive surge of power, it launched itself out of the water, not upwards, but forwards. The long, bony bill, honed to a razor point by evolution, functioned exactly as intended. It met Ron mid-lean, impaling him with the force of a battering ram. The fisherman had become the catch. He had gone to sea to claim a trophy, but in his hubris and haste, he ended up becoming a permanent part of the food chain. A stark reminder that in any contest between a man's ego and a 400-pound animal with a sword on its face, it's usually a good idea to bet on the sword. 1. There's a special kind of pride that comes from doing things yourself, a satisfying feeling of self-reliance. But when that DIY spirit wanders into the realm of high explosives, it often leads to a very short, very loud conclusion. In a picturesque Italian village, a woman named Isabella was brimming with festive ambition. The annual village festival, a celebration of local pride, was just around the corner, and Isabella was determined to make her mark. While her neighbors were content with store-bought fireworks, she saw them as impersonal, a soulless display of commercialism. Isabella, who considered herself a culinary artist and, by extension, a gifted amateur chemist, decided she would craft her own artisanal pyrotechnics. Her vision was of a breathtaking handcrafted spectacle that would paint the night sky with her personal signature. She delved into online forums and obscure historical texts, convinced she had unlocked the secrets of the masters. The heart of her recipe was black powder, a simple yet notoriously unstable mixture of sulfur, potassium nitrate, and charcoal. The stage for this delicate chemical ballet was her rustic, sun-drenched kitchen, a room filled with the comforting smells of garlic and oregano, and utterly unequipped for handling explosive compounds. She laid out her ingredients, but her ceramic mortar and pestle, a family heirloom, seemed too precious for this task. Instead, she opted for a heavy cast iron set she used for grinding tough spices, believing its sturdiness would be an asset. This was her critical, fatal error. The combination of a hard metal pestle grinding against a hard stone mortar with abrasive, crystalline powders caught between them is a perfect recipe for creating a spark. To Isabella, however, it just seemed more efficient. With the meticulous focus of a chef preparing a delicate sauce, she began to grind the chemicals together. A fine, gray powder started to form. She imagined the brilliant emerald greens and sapphire blues her creation would produce, a testament to her superior skill. She was so lost in her pyrotechnic daydream that she failed to notice the subtle but critical signs of danger: the slight metallic scrape, the faint smell of sulfur in the air. She was focused on the art, not the science. With a final, vigorous push of the pestle, it happened. A single, almost invisible spark, born from the friction of metal on stone, leaped into the fine, perfectly mixed powder. There was no warning, no dramatic fuse. There was only an instantaneous, violent detonation. The small pile of homemade gunpowder exploded with the force of a military-grade grenade. Her charming kitchen, a place of warmth and family meals, was instantly transformed into a smoldering crater. The force of the blast blew her windows out, sent shrapnel of her beloved copper pots through the walls, and turned her culinary sanctuary into a scene of utter devastation. Isabella's dream of a personal, artisanal light show had come true, just not in the way she had ever intended. It was a brutal, instantaneous lesson that some crafts are best left to professionals with blast shields and a healthy respect for the laws of chemistry. 2. In the rolling, often neglected countryside of Romania, a man named Grigore had declared a one-man war against his electricity bill. He viewed the utility company as a faceless monolith, and the towering power lines that crisscrossed his land not as infrastructure, but as a personal taunt, a river of free energy flowing just out of reach. Grigore was a man of action and simple, direct solutions. His solution to his energy crisis was a feat of audacious, profoundly misguided electrical piracy. He planned to tap directly into the 27,000-volt main power line that hummed menacingly overhead. His equipment was as crude as his plan was foolish. He had a long, thick electrical cable of dubious quality scavenged from a dumpster and a homemade grappling hook forged from a rusty piece of rebar. He wrapped the base of the hook with a thin layer of electrical tape, a gesture of insulation so pathetic it was laughable. A single, flimsy shield against a force of nature. One moonless night, Grigore put his plan into motion. He stood beneath the colossal utility pole, the air buzzing with an invisible, crackling power. He felt like a modern-day Prometheus, about to steal fire from the gods. He expertly swung the grappling hook and let it fly. It soared through the darkness, a perfect arc, and landed with a sharp metallic clang, securely snagging the high-voltage line. For a glorious half-second, he was a triumphant revolutionary. He had done it. He was connected. He had beaten the system. But the system he was trying to beat was not a bureaucracy. It was a fundamental law of physics. The moment the uninsulated metal of the hook made contact with the line, an immediate and apocalyptic connection was made. The 27,000 volts of raw power, always seeking the most efficient path to the ground, saw Grigore's body and his shoddily made cable as a brand-new, superconductive highway. A brilliant, blue-white arc of electricity erupted from the line, a miniature bolt of lightning that vaporized the dew in the air. The current surged down the cable with unimaginable speed and violence. The thin electrical tape on his hook offered as much protection as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. The massive voltage hit his body, and there was no time for pain or even a scream. He was instantly transformed into a human fuse, his body completing a circuit that it was never designed to handle. The light from the arc flash was so intense it lit up the entire field, a silent, strobing beacon of his failure. Grigore's quest for free electricity ended the moment it began. a stark and brutal reminder that some things are not worth stealing, and that when you challenge the power grid to a fight, the grid always wins. 3. There's a certain kind of youthful boredom that can lead to incredible creativity, or, in this case, to an innovation in stupidity that proved to be fatal. For a group of friends in a desolate corner of rural Russia, video games and movies had lost their thrill. They craved something more real, something with higher stakes. They decided to invent their own extreme sport, a high-octane version of paintball. But their version wouldn't involve brightly colored pellets and protective gear. Their game, born from a cocktail of bravado and a profound misunderstanding of ballistics, involved using real handguns loaded with what they believed were non-lethal wax bullets. The idea had formed during a late-night session of watching old action movies. "Imagine if we could do this for real," one of them had said. They meticulously crafted their own ammunition, melting down candles and casting the wax into bullet shapes. In their minds, they had created the perfect solution. All the adrenaline of a real firefight with none of the consequences. "It's just wax," they reasoned. "It'll sting, maybe leave a bruise, but it's safe." They established a few safety rules, the most crucial of which was a grimly ironic no headshots. Their chosen arena was an abandoned concrete warehouse, a crumbling skeleton of a building that provided the perfect, gritty backdrop for their game. They arrived, loaded their pistols with the waxy, misshapen rounds, and with the nervous excitement of soldiers heading into their first skirmish, the game began. The warehouse echoed with the loud crack of real gunfire, a sound that should have been a warning, but to them, it was just part of the thrill. During a tense standoff, two of the friends, Sasha and Ivan, found themselves on opposite sides of a crumbling pillar. They were close, barely 15 feet apart. In a rush of adrenaline, Ivan leaned out and fired, aiming for center mass. He expected a yelp, maybe a curse, and the satisfying thwack of wax on a jacket. Instead, Sasha collapsed without a sound, a small, dark mark appearing on his chest. The game came to a screeching halt. The friends rushed to his side, their adrenaline turning to ice-cold dread. They discovered the horrific truth that they had overlooked in their excitement. While a wax bullet is softer than lead, it is still a solid projectile. When fired from a real gun, it is propelled by the same explosive force and travels at a velocity that is more than capable of causing catastrophic, lethal injury, especially at close range. The non-lethal round had penetrated Sasha's chest cavity. Their quest for the ultimate realistic game had delivered an all-too-real consequence. They had tried to create a safe version of a deadly activity, but all they had managed to do was find a new, incredibly stupid way to die. 4. The search for eternal youth and perfect health has led humanity down some very strange paths. From fad diets to bizarre exercise routines, people will try almost anything to cheat time. In China, a woman named Li had found her own personal fountain of youth, a secret elixir she was convinced would grant her a long, vibrant life and flawless, radiant skin. Her magic potion wasn't some rare herb or expensive supplement. It was her own urine. Li was a devout practitioner of urine therapy, an ancient but thoroughly debunked form of alternative medicine. She had read countless testimonials on obscure internet forums from anonymous experts who swore by its miraculous properties. They claimed it was a sterile, nutrient-rich superhydrator that could cure everything from acne to cancer. Li was a true believer. For years, she dutifully followed the practice, drinking a glass of her own waste product every single morning. She became a vocal evangelist for the therapy, passionately trying to convert her skeptical friends and family. "You are throwing away liquid gold," she would insist. "It is the body's own perfect medicine." Her skin, she claimed, had never been clearer, and she felt more energetic than ever. What Li failed to understand, in her enthusiastic embrace of this folk remedy, was the fundamental purpose of urine. It is not the body's medicine. It is the body's sewage. It is the very specific liquid waste product that the kidneys, our body's incredibly efficient filtration system, have worked tirelessly to remove from the bloodstream. It is a concentrated cocktail of toxins, metabolic byproducts, and bacteria that the body has identified as harmful and needs to expel. By diligently drinking her urine every day, Lee was effectively forcing her kidneys to filter the same batch of toxins over and over again. She was putting her internal purification plant into a state of perpetual, exhausting overtime. Over the years, this constant reintroduction of waste products began to take its toll. Her kidneys, overworked and underappreciated, started to struggle. The very organs she was trying to cleanse were being systematically poisoned by her efforts. A chronic, low-grade infection took hold, a direct result of forcing a system designed for expulsion to constantly reabsorb. She likely mistook the symptoms, fatigue, aches, as signs that the therapy was working, that her body was detoxing. Eventually, the chronic infection flared up into an acute, severe kidney infection. Her system, weakened by years of self-sabotage, was unable to fight it off. Lee, the devoted wellness warrior who believed she had found the secret to eternal life, died from a completely preventable organ failure, a direct consequence of her daily ritual. She had tried to turn her body's waste into a superfood, but all she had managed to do was poison herself from the inside out. 5. In the sprawling, sun-baked landscape of the American Southwest, a woman we'll call Brenda was the proud owner of an unusual pet, a fully grown 6-foot-tall emu named Eric. To Brenda, Eric was more than a pet. He was an investment. She had read online that emu eggs were a valuable delicacy, a gourmet superfood that could fetch a high price at specialty markets. She pictured a lucrative side hustle, a small fortune laid daily in her own backyard. There was just one problem. Eric was a notoriously protective parent, especially during nesting season. As a male emu, it was his job to incubate the large emerald green eggs, and he took this duty very, very seriously. Brenda, however, saw his paternal instincts not as a warning, but as an obstacle to her profits. One sweltering afternoon, she decided it was time to collect her investment. She spotted Eric sitting diligently on a nest containing several large, valuable-looking eggs. As she approached, Eric's demeanor changed instantly. He rose to his full, intimidating height, his feathers bristled, and he let out a deep, guttural hissing sound, a clear and unambiguous warning to back off. Brenda, blinded by visions of dollar signs, completely ignored these signals. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Eric," she probably cooed, treating the large, powerful bird like a fussy house cat. She continued her advance, a wicker basket in hand, ready to collect her prize. The emu's hissing grew louder, more aggressive. He began to stomp his powerful 3-toed feet. This was the final warning, the emu equivalent of a flashing red light and a blaring siren. But Brenda was committed. She reached her hand into the nest, her fingers just inches from the precious eggs. That was the last straw. The emu, its protective instincts pushed to their absolute limit, reacted with the lightning-fast, brutal efficiency that has allowed its species to survive for millions of years. Unlike most birds, emus kick forward, not backward, with a force that has been compared to a heavyweight boxer. But with a deadly addition, each of their 3 toes is tipped with a long, razor-sharp claw, capable of disemboweling a dingo. Before Brenda could even register what was happening, Eric lunged forward and delivered a single devastating kick to her torso. The force of the blow was immense, and the claws did their intended job with horrific precision. Brenda collapsed, her get-rich-quick scheme ending in a bloody, tragic mess. She had looked at a powerful, wild animal and seen only a walking ATM, completely misjudging the primal power of a parent protecting its young. She had gambled her life for a few gourmet eggs, a brutal lesson that some omelets come at a price far too high to pay. 6. The Sonoran Desert of Arizona is a place of stark, beautiful, and dangerously deceptive simplicity. Its most iconic resident is the saguaro cactus, a majestic, towering symbol of the American West. These giants can live for over 150 years and grow to be over 40 feet tall, weighing several tons. They are also a protected species, and stealing one is a serious crime. For one man, let's call him Lenny, the law was less of a concern than the potential profit. He saw a magnificent, mature saguaro standing in a remote part of the desert and decided it would look much better in a wealthy person's landscaped garden, and the finder's fee would look much better in his own pocket. His plan was as simple as it was stupid. He would dig up the massive cactus and simply pull it over. hoping to load it onto a truck later. He spent hours under the blistering Arizona sun, digging a trench around the base of the cactus. The saguaro, which he estimated weighed at least 500 pounds, had a very shallow root system, as most cacti do. Lenny saw this as a weakness he could exploit. After severing the main roots, the giant plant began to lean. This was it, the moment of triumph. He tied a rope around the cactus, stood on the opposite side, and began to pull with all his might. He was going to fell this desert titan like a lumberjack. He misjudged two critical things: the immense top-heavy weight of the saguaro and its trajectory. As he gave one final, mighty heave, the cactus gave way. But it didn't fall away from him as he had planned. Instead, it toppled directly towards him. He had been standing in the absolute worst possible spot. He had a split second to register his colossal miscalculation before the 500-pound plant, a living column covered in thousands of needle-sharp spines, fell directly on top of him. The weight of the cactus crushed him, pinning him instantly to the hard, sun-baked desert floor. His attempt to steal a symbol of the desert had ended with him being literally defeated and impaled by a plant. He had gone out into the wilderness to prove his dominance over nature. But nature, in its slow, silent, and spiky way, had the final say. He became a permanent, tragic part of the very landscape he was trying to plunder, a human scarecrow in a garden of his own making. 7. The factory floor is often a place of monotonous, grinding routine. To break the tedium, workers will sometimes resort to small pranks or feats of strength to entertain each other. On one such afternoon at a cement factory, a worker named Marco decided it was his turn to be the center of attention. Marco was a big, strong guy, and he was proud of it. He saw his colleagues, weary from a long shift, and decided they needed a show. He was going to put on a performance of strength and dexterity, something that would make him a legend of the lunchroom. His props of choice: 3 50-pound bags of dry cement. His act: juggling. To his colleagues, this sounded like a recipe for a hernia. But Marco was brimming with the kind of unshakable confidence that often precedes a disaster. He brushed off their concerns with a laugh. He had practiced with lighter objects, he claimed, and he was ready for the main event. He positioned himself in an open area of the warehouse, the dusty air swirling around him. He hefted the first 50-pound bag, its weight a comfortable and familiar burden. He tossed it into the air with a grunt, a perfect, gentle arc. As it reached its apex, he grabbed the second bag and launched it, his timing surprisingly good. The two heavy bags were now cycling through the air, a slow-motion ballet of brute force. The small crowd of onlookers cheered him on, their initial skepticism turning to genuine awe. Emboldened by their applause, Marco went for the grand finale. He reached down, scooped up the third 50-pound bag, and with a mighty heave, sent it skyward to join the others. For one brief, glorious moment, he did it. He was a circus strongman, a master of the impossible, juggling 150 pounds of construction material as if it were nothing. He was a god of gravel, but the laws of physics are a harsh critic. Juggling 150 pounds requires not just incredible strength, but also flawless timing and precision, neither of which are easy to maintain when you're essentially throwing small boulders into the air. As the first bag began its descent, Marco was slightly out of position from having thrown the third. He reached for it, but his timing was off by a fraction of a second. Instead of catching the bag cleanly, his hand glanced off the side. The bag, now uncontrolled, tumbled directly downwards, its trajectory aimed squarely at the one place it could do the most damage: his head. The 50-pound bag of densely packed cement landed with a sickening, heavy thud. It wasn't a glancing blow. It was a direct pile-driver impact. He collapsed instantly, the other two bags raining down around him. His act, which had lasted less than a minute, was indeed memorable, but not for the reasons he had hoped. He had wanted to impress his colleagues with his strength, but all he did was provide a grim, dusty lesson in the difference between being strong and being smart. 8. Family reunions are a time for catching up, sharing stories, and, for some, indulging in a bit of light-hearted mischief. At one such gathering, a man named Dave, a notorious prankster in his family, decided to pull off what he thought would be the ultimate game of hide-and-seek. He was going to make himself disappear, to create a moment of hilarious, manufactured panic. His chosen hiding spot was a beautiful, but foreboding, antique chest that sat in the corner of his grandmother's attic. It was a massive, heavy, cedar-lined hope chest from the early 1900s, a family heirloom. To Dave, it was the perfect prop for his prank. With a mischievous grin, he snuck away from the party, crept up to the dusty attic, and lifted the heavy lid of the chest. It was spacious. Perfect. He planned to wait inside until his relatives started to worry, then burst out with a triumphant yell, revealing his brilliant hiding spot. He climbed in, pulled the heavy lid down over him, and the attic was plunged into darkness. What Dave had failed to notice in his playful haste was the chest's locking mechanism. It was an old-fashioned spring-loaded latch, a type of lock designed to secure its contents from the outside. Once the lid was fully closed, a heavy bolt would automatically slide into place, and it could not be opened from the inside. There was no internal handle, no emergency release. It was a one-way door. As Dave lay in the dark, the stale, musty air filling his lungs, he heard the faint, solid click of the lock engaging. At first, he didn't think much of it. But when he decided the joke had gone on long enough and tried to push the lid open, it wouldn't budge. A cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. The prank was no longer funny. He began to push harder, to shout, his voice muffled by the thick wood. Downstairs, his relatives did hear faint, thumping sounds coming from the ceiling. They chuckled to themselves. "That's just Dave," his cousin probably said. "He's probably trying to scare us." They assumed it was all part of the game, that his muffled cries were just him hamming it up for effect. They continued their party, laughing and sharing stories, completely unaware of the real-life horror story unfolding directly above their heads. As the hours passed, Dave's oxygen supply began to dwindle in the near-airtight container. His frantic struggles gave way to a desperate, silent blackness. He was found the next day, a tragic victim of his own misplaced sense of humor, his final unfunny prank having gone terribly, fatally wrong. 9. In the strange, often idiotic world of viral internet challenges, the barrier to entry is low, but the potential cost can be incredibly high. One of the most infamous of these was the Cinnamon Challenge, a deceptively simple dare that swept across social media. The challenge was straightforward. Attempt to swallow a single dry tablespoon of ground cinnamon in under 60 seconds without any water. It sounds harmless, almost trivial. It is anything but. Our protagonist is a teenager named Mark, who, like many his age, was eager for online fame and the validation of his peers. He saw the countless videos of people attempting the challenge, coughing, gagging, and spewing clouds of brown powder, and thought, "I can do that." He wanted the views, the likes, the comments. He set up his phone to record, grabbed a jar of cinnamon from his kitchen spice rack, and with the bravado of a seasoned internet stuntman, he addressed his future audience. "All right, guys, today I'm going to crush the cinnamon challenge," he announced. He then tipped a heaping tablespoon of the fine brown powder into his mouth. The immediate effect was not what he expected. Ground cinnamon is not like other foods. It's an incredibly fine desiccated powder made from tree bark. It doesn't dissolve in saliva. Instead, it instantly absorbs every last bit of moisture in the mouth, creating a thick, gag-inducing sludge that is nearly impossible to swallow. Panicking, Mark did what anyone would do when their throat is suddenly clogged with a dry, spicy cement. He gasped. It was a reflexive, involuntary inhalation, and it was his fatal mistake. Instead of going down his esophagus, the fine powder was sucked directly into his windpipe and lungs. The cinnamon wasn't just an irritant. It was a catastrophic invader. The powder, which contains cellulose fibers that don't break down in the lungs, coated the delicate, moist surfaces of his alveoli, the tiny air sacs responsible for oxygen exchange. This immediately triggered a violent inflammatory response and pulmonary edema. His lungs, in a desperate attempt to protect themselves, began to fill with fluid. He wasn't just coughing, he was suffocating. He had won the internet points he so desperately craved. But in the process, he had lost the only game that truly matters. He became a tragic statistic, a permanent warning about the hidden dangers of a seemingly harmless prank, and a grim testament to the fact that not all viral challenges are worth the click. 10. The durian fruit is a legend in Southeast Asia, known for two things: its custardy, delicious flesh, and its formidable, spiky, armor-plated husk that gives it the aroma of a gas leak. For a man in a small village in the Philippines, the craving for this king of fruits became an overwhelming, impatient obsession. He stood in his yard, staring up at a tall durian tree, a magnificent 50-foot specimen laden with the prized, spiky fruit. One particular durian, large and ripe, taunted him from a high branch. He was too impatient to wait for it to fall naturally, as is the custom, and too lazy to attempt the difficult climb. He decided on a more direct, brute force approach to harvesting. His chosen method: he would knock it down by throwing rocks at it. This plan, in itself, is not entirely insane. The fatal flaw was not in his method, but in his chosen location to execute it. In a display of logic so flawed it's almost poetic, he decided that the best place to stand while throwing rocks at a heavy object 50 feet directly above his head was, in fact, directly underneath it. He began his bombardment, picking up stones from the ground and hurling them upwards. His first few attempts missed, the rocks clattering uselessly through the leaves. But he was determined. He picked up a larger, heavier rock, took careful aim, and threw it with all his might. This time, he was successful. The rock struck the durian's thick stem with a satisfying thwack. He watched triumphantly as the heavy, spiky fruit, which can weigh up to 7 pounds, detached from the branch and began its journey to the ground. He had won. His prize was on its way. It was only in that final, split second, as the durian grew larger and larger in his field of vision, that he seemed to realize his catastrophic miscalculation. He had completely failed to account for the simple, universal, and utterly unforgiving law of gravity. The fruit, which he had so skillfully dislodged, followed a perfect vertical path straight down, landing directly on his head with the force of a medieval mace. He had been so focused on the how of getting the durian down that he had completely ignored the what happens next, a fatal oversight that turned his triumphant harvest into his final, tragic act. All right, forget hypotheticals. Let's talk real life. Every single person watching this has ignored a bad feeling at least once and gotten away with it. What was the situation? I want to read the real stories in the comments. That time you almost became a Darwin Award nominee. If you're thankful that gut feeling was wrong just once, hit the like button and subscribe for more reminders to listen to it.